good morning, everyone. I think we've got everybody out of the waiting room now. Good morning and welcome to our flood recovery session. We're really pleased to have you joining us today. I think, as you know, we do these the second Thursday of each month at 10:30. My name is Sharon Mortensen, and I serve as President and CEO at Midland Area Community Foundation. And we're pleased to do these calls in connection with the long-term recovery group of Midland County. And our purpose is to educate the community about the work of the long-term recovery group and also aspects of flood recovery. We want to make sure that each month we bring a topic to you that's of great interest. So if you do have suggestions for us, we certainly welcome those. Today's topic is the Four Lakes Task Force, moving from recovery to restoration. Special thanks to Dave Kepler, the president of the Four Lakes Task Force, for joining us today. I did want to mention some of our previous topics and where you can find those. We have a variety of those. They can be found at midlandfoundation.org. That's midlandfoundation.org or reliefmidland.org, reliefmidland.org. And some of the topics that we've covered to date have been how long-term recovery is set up and an overview of case management, FEMA, mental well-being, flood recovery for business, city and county housing codes, case management and volunteering, your flood recovery dollars at work, Sanford recovery. And we've looked before, we've had Four Lakes Task Force join us before as we were talking about some of the recovery work. And today they're going to be talking about restoration. Now, these topics are all meant to help educate you about things that are underway in our community as we continue to recover from the dam failures and flooding that happened 10 months ago. We are involved with the long-term recovery group because we are one of two funds held in the community to assist with flood recovery, with United Way of Midland County holding that other flood recovery fund, and working together with a variety of organizations and individuals throughout the community. We form the long-term recovery group and helping to address the needs of our community moving forward. Couple quick logistics things before we get started. The call will be recorded today. And obviously, since we do post these afterward, and we ask that you post questions in the chat box. And at the end, I will take those questions and pose those to Dave and put some of the questions that might be related together. One thing that could be helpful as you pose questions today, if you could list the city or township where you live, so if there are specifics in your question related to that, we can add those as we look at answering those questions for you. So just a little quick background as we start here. It'll be 10 months ago, May 19th, two dams failed and the resulting flooding was devastating to our community in the face of the already challenging circumstances of the global pandemic. The long-term recovery group, and really as we look at what happened, neighbors have helped neighbors. The community has come together in an unbelievable and inspiring way to help address the needs of individuals, of businesses, of organizations across our community. And Four Lakes Task Forces focus their work on restoration of the dams in the area. Dave Kepler, who serves as president and chairman for the Four Lakes Task Force, is a former executive vice president for Dow Chemical Company. He had a 39-year career that started in California, and he lived in various assignments in the United States, Canada, and the Pacific. He's a member of the board of directors of 3 public companies. He serves on the board of trustees of the University of California, Berkeley Foundation, because he graduated from the University of California, Berkeley. He is president, as I mentioned, of the Four Lakes Task Force, a nonprofit that has a mission to recover and restore the Four Michigan lakes in Midland and Gladwin counties that were significantly impacted when 2 dams failed back on May 19th of 2020. He resides in Sanford with his wife, Patty, and they founded the Patricia and David Kepler Foundation that focuses on improving the quality of life and economic development in Midland County. They have multiple social and economic investments within Midland County, including the Midland Brewing Company, Cottage Creamery, the Lazy Turtle Ranch, and Pathfinders Commons. So thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today to talk about Four Lakes Task Force Recovery to Restoration.
Well, thanks, Sharon, and appreciate the biography. Most of those things I'm spending a little less time on lately, given the challenges here with the recovery and the restoration. But happy to be here, and looking forward to the dialogue over the time period here. Just quickly before we go to the slides, I know there's something that Four Lakes Task Force is a nonprofit. It was brought together over the actually in several stages with the lake associations in the recognition of issues that were occurring on the lake, and the need to transfer the ownership from a private ownership to a public ownership. And unfortunately that didn't happen. And in the course of prior to the dams failing, but when the Edenville Dam was revoked, we got with the counties and looked at making sure we established legal lake levels and provided a legal structure to assume ownership. Unfortunately, that was to have occurred in June of 2022, or I'm sorry, June of 2020, and we had the failure, and we kind of had to restart. And Dave Rothman was here last time to cover kind of where we were at in the recovery time. We're right at that pivot point. We have a meeting with the joint counties in May, and we'll have a kind of a feasible path forward to restoration and recovery. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, that'd be great. So before I started, one of the questions was pre-submitted to me, and I thought it fit well because it was a combination of many things that came in, and it actually being, I'm sure there's a mix of lake owners on here, but also a mix of obviously people downstream of Midland. My family has a lot of investment in Midland. We live in Edenville. But the question was, what are the thoughts and feelings of Midland residents, the Community Foundation, and Dow Chemical? If the dams are not rebuilt, would each of these entities be concerned, or you think the floods will never return to Midland because all the lakes are now rivers? And I think it was like multiple questions. But first of all, I would say that the Midland Community Foundation has provided us funds, Dow Chemical has provided us funds, Consumer Energy has provided us funds, and we've, in terms of private funding over this last year, we've had over $4 million of private funding. So there's a lot of support to bring the lakes back up. Dow's brought up a little bit because there's a perception that maybe there's a flood control aspect to this. And I wanted to make sure we covered these points. I'm going to cover these points in the meeting, but I wanted to make sure I start with them, because sometimes when you go through 20 slides, you miss the key takeaways. These are not flood control lakes. The benefit of the lakes for the last, since they were in inception, had started out as hydro lakes and hydropower lakes with a deeded aspect of recreation. And they never were designed for flood control or invested in flood control. And what I would say is historical flooding is not going to substantially change because these lakes are down. These dams should not have failed. And if they were managed properly, and they weren't, and that's an issue we have to address going forward. But the community still needs to recognize they're located at the base of 3 major rivers, and we need to manage the risk to accept the benefit. You know, the reality is we're near water. Most communities' risk when you look at FEMA are around water, but so you get a benefit with water, but there's also a risk you have to manage. And I know the community, Midland community is we're trying to work with them to make sure we have the right viewpoint downstream. The other thing I would say is it's not just a choice of whether we bring the lakes up or not. The property just can't be abandoned. These lakes are really the best alternative, is to restore the ecosystem. Otherwise, there's a significant cleanup that's going to happen long term. And I feel like, you know, we have to kind of look at this in terms of the next 2 months and getting the feasibility that not only the lake communities understand, but also the downstream communities as well. So I welcome the opportunity to talk here. The next slide, please. So real quickly, and I'm just doing a little Dam 101 discussion. I thought I would focus, because we've just had several meetings in the community and all the dams. And I thought just focusing on Sanford as a case study, all the dams have similar issues and structures. Obviously, Secord and Smallwood weren't destroyed, but they um, do have major repairs. And then I'll kind of cover the overall plan and recovery and restoration, and then we can go to questions and answers. So the next slide. So just really quickly, the scope of this, and I think some of you have seen that there was a dam safety task force that was put together after this. We provided input for that. But, you know, dams, there are dams that today have existed for over 1,000 years. That's actually a few that have existed for 2,000 years. So there's 90,000 dams. So there is a way to manage those dams. There's 2,500 dams in Michigan. 235 of them roughly fit under this Part 307 we'll talk about, which are publicly owned lakes. 99 of them are hydropower. The rest of them are usually privately owned or community community owned or managed. And there's a Part 307 you'll hear about that manages the public ownership of lakes, and Part 315 that regulates the dam sites. The uses of dams, obviously power is one, flood control, water supply, recreation, irrigation. And if you go to the next slide, the discussion, I want to have one slide on the discussion of a flood control dam here a little bit, and why these dams aren't flood control. And there's many ways to do this. Sometimes the spillways are flexible and move up and down. Sometimes they're just a auxiliary spillway that you see in this picture. So you see a lake there, and you see a dam, which is the green, basically dike, and then the ability to flow over. And so this is a very simple dam where the auxiliary spillway capacity is kind of basically when there's a big rainfall, it slows up the water, it fills up the lake, and then it starts to go over the spillway capacity. So you manage floods going downstream. And there's several of these in Midland, I'm sorry, in Michigan, that are actually left empty. The challenge, if you go and look at the lakes in here, is there's just not significant capacity in these lakes to develop them as flood control. It doesn't mean we can't manage better and coordinate better, have better emergency response, do all the things we have to do and have solid dams, but they just fundamentally, even if they were put back up and kept empty, it wouldn't be enough capacity to really make a material or really significant difference in that process and stuff. And the other thing that we would have is, frankly, the difference in this picture and the pictures we're talking about is the community around the lake. They're not just trees around the lake, there's communities around these lakes. And the higher you build the dams, the more the backside floods. So we can build these dams right, but we just need to make sure that we understand the use of these are primarily for the value we get out of recreation, fishery, and the economic benefit that comes from them. Next slide, please. So sometimes it's important to put things in perspective, I think. So the map on the left side is the 4 lakes, and you see it goes all the way from, starts at the base in Sanford and goes all the way past 61 and Gladwin up to Secord Dam. And if you translate over to the picture on the right, you'll see the little red box there that represents that area. And the little green star there is Samford Dam, and the little yellow star there is Midland. So I've had people tell me that when they've seen their house flood over the 3 floods that have happened in 86, 2017, and then 2020, that based on the gauge that they have downstream, that they saw different flood levels over those times. We have a lot of engineers in towns that measure that. And there's a reason for that. If you look at the 3 basins, there's the Sanford Dam watershed, or the 4 Lakes watershed, that brings all the water through Sanford Dam. But that represents 40% of the water that comes down into Midland. The other 60% come from the other rivers, the Pine and the Chippewa, the Salt River, that bring those down. So that's 60% of the water. And you'll see that especially in the Samford Dam as we go forward. So one of the challenges we have here is that one is there's a lot of flood area and in this area, and we're at the basin of that as we sit in Midland, Michigan. So it's not just about addressing in long-term flood management, not just about addressing these 4 lakes, but also how you manage the flows and structures of these other streams down there. So this body represents 40%, the other represents 60, and these lakes are shallow enough that it doesn't make too much of a difference. So we'll walk through, I wanted to put that together because you'll see how we're approaching this from a risk approach for these dams, how we're making sure that we can put them in and not increase the risk of flooding going forward. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. But I think sometimes it's perspective when we talk about flooding to understand where the water comes from. And there's a tridge down there, and all that water comes down to work through that. We are in the process, by the way, of putting gauges on almost all these rivers, similar to the ones we have down at the Dow plant, because one of the big challenges there, this system is not well instrumented for the systems as we go forward to work on. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So this is the kind of the Sanford Dam case study. The dam was built for power generation. It's now a legally established lake under Part 307 is what it's there to create. And as I said, it's not a dam material to flood control. You can see, by the way, just the depth of this thing is only several feet, and the amount of water that was going through this is significant. So that's one of the things we have to address is how to manage and increase the spillway capacity, and we'll talk about that. So the next slide. And just really, folks talk about hydropower a little bit. On the left side is the Hoover Dam. That's kind of an iconic dam. It's not the largest dam in terms of height, but it's pretty high at 726 feet. That is develops about 2,000 megawatts. And on the other side of that, that's about 1,000 times bigger than Sanford Lake. And it generated about 3 megawatts. And give people perspective, that's about 2 average windmills. I think the new GE windmills are about 5 megawatts, but most of the windmills you see around this area are about 1.5 megawatts. So at this point in time, we're not looking at hydropower to work on this. The most important thing is to work on managing this so that we can get the recreational value back, and we can make sure we're managing this in the safe way for the community. Next slide. So what happened in the May flood is, I think people have seen the dam, significant issues, the left and right bank both overtopped. The right bank breached, and the powerhouse and equipment were damaged. And the big issue that happened here, you see this kind of fuse plug spillway on the right-hand side that's sitting there. If anybody ever looked at the dam before, the dam, what they call the right embankment, and maybe let me clear up before we go too far. When I say right, the right embankment is how you look at it when you're upstream of the dam looking downstream at it. So the right embankment's really on the left side and the left embankment's on the right side. But on that right embankment side that's labeled there was a fuse plug there. And the theory of that was that it was supposed to basically that section of the dam was supposed to break away to protect the rest of the dam and have a controlled flow through the system and bypass it. The investigation is there, but first of all, they don't design systems like that anymore, and it didn't perform right. And that's one of the issues we have here. That's not something we would put back in. It's not something that would be recommended. Next structure. So right now there's about $10 million of projects underway, not to rebuild the water level, but just over the next year to restabilize that system, to bring the water back to the river that it is and move it around the embreachment, to put flood control structures in place for up to 200-year floods, to get the sediment out, get the debris moved out, and working through that. And so we're having both state and federal funding working on this. And this is a project that we will start. Well, we actually are doing the engineering and all this work now, and we'll be starting this this spring, early summer, and hopefully have it done. The plan is to have it done before the next rain season to work through. The next one, and I think this is a key thing that gets us to understand floods. So the long-term restoration issues for Samford Dam. So what does it take to build it back up? Well, a key area is spillway capacity. Sanford's classified as a high hazard dam. Prior to May 2020, the total spillway capacity was approximately 36,000 feet. Yeah, you're on the right slide there. It was approximately about 36,000 cubic feet per second. And I said the spillway that fuse plug didn't break, so you didn't even have that capacity. And prior to the failure, the state requirement for that dam was 37,000 cubic feet per second. And where we're looking at now, one of the things we're studying is the frequency of rain has changed. The understanding of these models are different. And our belief is that spillway capacity should be more in the 47,000 cubic feet per second. But we have to finalize that based on regional flood studies. So rain studies have not been done in this area, specific rain studies to inform us on the construction of these dams or anything else in Midland for a long time. And so we want to do the rain studies that model the frequency of the rains, and then look at the probable maximum flood, and then we'll design the dams based on that. This is the state of Michigan's new task force is suggesting that we follow the FEMA requirements will be the new requirements. So we're building these dams above the current state requirements, but in line with what is viewed as best practice now. And so those are where we think the numbers are. We're doing our engineering around that, but it'll take till the end of the year to get all these studies and modeling done. Next slide. So a risk-based approach is we're looking at the flood event. So if you look at the box on the left-hand side, the flood event would be, if you imagine you have points for like the 50-year flood, the 100-year flood, the 200-year flood, the 500-year flood, the 1,000-year flood, the 5,000-year flood, and some of these, and our view is that when you build a dam, it's got to have that at least 1,000 years. Some of them will be, I'm guessing these will be greater than that when we're done. If you look at the consequence, then what you're looking at is what happens if the dam fails and what happens if a dam doesn't fail. So what we're looking at is when there's a flood event, is the dam compounding the risk. So what we have to do is make sure the spillway can handle the 100-year flood, the 200-year flood. But at some point in time, we get to a level where the size of the dam doesn't matter. There's so much water around the system that the amount of damage that's caused, the dam doesn't make a difference. And so there's no sense in spending a lot of money when that blue line, when the blue line and red line start to cross, it doesn't make any sense to start to spend a lot more money on the dam spillway if in fact there's no additional risk to flooding. You'd rather spend that money. That doesn't mean the flooding goes away. It just means that the dam isn't a part of the reason the environment's flooding. And so there's no sense in building a bigger dam. You should be putting that money someplace else. And so the big challenge was these were pretty prescriptive requirements in the past. And unfortunately, FERC and Boyce argued about this for 20 years, and it turns out the numbers were wrong. This is a much more state-of-the-art way of looking at dams and trying to look at how we design them. So a visual view of that, if we go to the next slide, so tailwater is the water that comes after the dam. Now, this was before the Eden Bill. This was before the Eden Bill failure. And this is what's happened in all the other dams for people that are, all the other rain systems for people that have been around this system. If you look at the headwater and the tailwater in that left picture, you'll see that the dam, there's very little flow left, and that and if you look at on the right side, you see the switch yard where the structure is. The system down is already the system down is already flooded. If you look at that switch yard, you look at the system, and that little flow over the right, you start to see that the embankment's starting to overflow, and the system hasn't released. And so the reality is you're getting to the point where it doesn't matter whether the dam's there or not. Once you get to a size, you're going to get to the point where other water from the other rivers. So, this water is not coming through the system as fast because it's already backed up into Midland. So we have to deal with the whole overall floodplain. But the view is we can build a dam system using this kind of methodology if we understand the rainfalls, understand the frequencies, and rebuild the dams to work on that. So the next, and you see on the bottom slide, it's just the floodplain, kind of whether the dam doesn't break or not, things flood because it goes around it or it goes up to it because of the Salt River. So we're modeling this with floods that are advanced, and assuming that the floods get backed up. We're looking at how the dams would fail if they were cascaded. All those things need to be looked at. Next slide. So the other thing is the issue that we have to do is the water retaining structure itself. The right embankment was breached. The spillway capacity wasn't there. We're putting in new gates. We have to rebuild the embankments that, in fact, right now what we're doing is going to most of these dams and boring into every one of these embankments and understanding, are they properly constructed, and actually reconstruct new spillways or bring them up to standard. The next slide probably gives a good overview of everything we're doing. So you see on the right of the slide, the crest gate spillways. These are gates that, the other gates pulled up. These gates move down. They'll have significantly more capacity, and they'll get the flow direction in there. And then we will rebuild the embankments, but we will also have this labyrinth spillway to handle significant flooding greater than we've had in the past, to kind of bring it back into the river. But as I said, we can only build so much here because the system starts to get bigger than this if we get into 500-year, 1,000-year floods kind of things to work through. So I think people need to understand that 2020 was an historical flood, and then it got compounded because we had a dam that was under-designed at the end of its life and really under private ownership with federal oversight that wasn't keeping the dam up to speed. And we've got a whole different, we can't run dams this way, and there's whole focus on doing this right moving forward. And I want to leave people with that view. So this is a very significant investment. It's in the the investment we did in October. I'm sorry, about October was about $90 million to put all this in. I think we feel good that it's probably lower than that now. We'll have better numbers in a few weeks, and that's what we'll be presenting to the board. Next slide. Part 307. Okay, so I just want to make sure that the whole framework of restoration here is part 307 is a legal normal lake level. So folks have asked about this a lot, but in the view to build this means that the levels of the water have been agreed to by the counties, by the state, and by all the agencies, that this is the proper level to run these waters at. And so we have to build the environmental view around it, the economic view, and the safety view around it. And that's what we're working through. But we do have legal lake levels, and that's what's allowed us actually to get funding to do some of the stabilization. Okay, next slide. I do point out that I know there's a lot of emotion about assessments and how much this is going to cost the community. That, you know, the establishment of these lake levels is one thing, the financing is another. That has to go through the county approval to approve the rolls. But we have obtained, you know, almost $50 million to get to the point that we can do those studies. We're still $4 or $5 million short to get everything done before we get into assess, you know, to start to actually finance the reconstruction. But we'll be a long way to stabilizing these dams by the end of 2021. Next slide. So I've showed this to the lake community a lot. There's a recovery phase. We simply must have it, get it done. And there should be a lake restoration. And our view is that now the best alternative is to restore the lakes. And we will show other alternatives in the May study that we're bringing out here. The preliminary costs in October were $338 for all 4 dams. We believe that number will be, we gave a range between 250 and 400, I think, and we believe that that number is going to be lower than 300 when we're all done, but I don't have all the numbers yet to work on. The alternative, though, is you can't just say we're going to stabilize it and walk away. You can't leave this infrastructure out there. It has to be operated and managed. It has to be maintained, and there is no and there's a tremendous amount of environmental repair that has to happen if these lakes don't come back. Okay, next slide. So real quickly, the recovery phase. You've got the plan, we got the funds, we have control of the property, and we're implementing this. A lot of people helping us out. It's a steady state, but it's not the end state. It can't be the end state, but it will give us safety. Next slide. Okay, so there's a whole pipeline of projects that we put together. A big issue here is erosion. It continues to be, you know, the slide here is the Sanford model. We did clean up the debris. There's still probably an $8 million debris cleanup on the lake, and there's cleanup still around the base of the lake and in the community. And our plan is to have we have a funded program to support downstream of the dam to clean up. And we also have a big project to get the debris off the bottom land. And early next year, we're evaluating and looking at putting a boom in to collect any other debris that may come down. It may be several years for all this debris to clean up to do. We've done a lot of erosion projects and working through that. I had a couple of examples to show people if we go to the next slide. You know, if you look at this thing, you have this issue where things over time kind of the rivers are moving and they undercut. In other words, the rivers are lower, so these banks are high now, and some of them are getting undercut. The culverts are filled and they're getting undercut. Here was a fairly simple project where it was done with grass and structure. People cleaned out the area to protect the ground, to make sure there wasn't further erosion, to protect their property. Did it with grass and seed and managed it pretty, pretty much. It's straightforward, expensive for the homeowner, but it's manageable. And with a project like that could be done. You see, it still takes a lot of work to do that. So this is part of our recovery. If you look at the next slide, this is a much more major position where you look at the failures of some of the things. This is a court, or a culvert, and the structure that has to be put in to manage that. Otherwise, all this sediment kind of moves out, threatens the shoreline of these homes, and moves through. And then one more I think we might have just to show people, so there's an example where the culvert is actually threatening the house, and we built a better flow back to the river to work. There's still a lot of these going on. Next slide. So just on the updates, we've the Secord and Smallwood stabilization is basically done. And there's about the repairs for the winter were done. I think each dam, we've got about $700,000 on each dam. We still have to put booms up to protect the navigation and structure around the dams and stuff. So probably when we're all done, probably roughly $1 million on each of those dams to stabilize them. Edenville Dam, the tobacco spillway, is pretty much nearing completion, and they've lowered the water there to protect the downstream on that. Tittabawassee has major work to be done. That's about that's about an $8 million project for those two rivers to get stabilized, so the dam, is there and can be managed. And then Sanford, as I mentioned, we have all the work there. It's probably 9 million or so for 8 to 10 million for the dam, and probably 6 to 8 million for the debris cleanup. Still left to do. Okay, the next slide. So basically this year we have a pretty large budget, and a lot of that's supported by federal grants and state grants. We'll spend approximately $37 million next year on stabilizing this property and these dams, and we'll basically have another $6 or $7 million where we're doing the studies and running and doing the engineering for some of these dams to move forward to the next phase. But I would say with all this risk, we're significantly lowering the risk. We still have to get through the spring here, and we don't have all the work done, but I think we're basically getting to the point of moving from recovery to restoration and stuff to work through. Next slide. So the other thing we're doing, I think, is just to understand that this wasn't a well-implemented system in terms of instrumentation. We've got a lot of on each dam, we're putting better gauges, rain gauges, weather stations. We also are working with the USGS and installing gauges at Seacar Dam Road and on the Salt River, even things that aren't in our basin. I showed you that big area. It's not just measuring what's in the Four Lakes, but all the other streams as well. And the gauge we had downstream is downstream of everything. These are starting to move upstream, so we can be more predictable what's going on, not only for the Four Lakes, but for the county and the communities within the lakes and downstream. Next slide. Hope I'm going fast now. Restoration, what we're going through by the end of May is coming up with the best alternative. And we'll go through that from an economic environmental alternative and the feasibility of bringing these lakes up, which we think we will, basically it's about what critical issues do we have to address before we bring the lakes up. Next slide. That's underway. It'll talk about the use and function of the lakes. Why do we have to talk about that? Because it gets to where things can be funded and how they're going to be looked at and how they're going to be managed in the future. We're having a survey of the property owners to get their view. We're doing that with public sector consultants, so it's arm's length from us, and we're working through that to make sure that we get a view that can inform. It's not a vote or anything, but it informs the community what's going on. And we'll have new refined estimates on dam construction and environmental costs, and come up with kind of a closer view of what the assessments will be. And I think we'll be ready to move forward with Secord and Smallwood. And then, kind of have to still do some engineering work around Edenville and Sanford. Next slide. So this is a rough timeline. We're in this recovery phase. Sanford, Secord, and Smallwood are there. We'll be kind of somewhere by 2022. I'd say 80% done by 2021, but some of these things will last till 2022. We need to get the financing approved. That takes a fair amount of time. We've got to go through then, it's pretty significant engineering and modeling and structure. And then there's a bid letting process and then constructions. So some people see this as a slow schedule. Others see this as a very aggressive schedule. But if we can get $4 or $5 more million of financing this year at least, but we probably need 8 overall, we can get to these timelines without having to get interim financing and put that burden on the property owners and be faster. If we don't get that, then this will extend. But right now, we feel coming forward that we can get a plan that gets Secord and Smallwood up in 2024, Sanford up in 2025, and Wixom up in 2026. Next slide. I think we're kind of close now. So, the point I left with earlier, dams or no dams, Midland is still exposed to flooding. We're working with the Business Alliance in Midland County to make sure we integrate the flood mitigation downstream and working with how the dams fit into that. And that's a program that's kind of underway, and we'll continue to work with them on that. Next slide. So we're working towards a future that includes lakes in Midland and Gladwin County. We'll report to the counties in May. Funding and funding is and affordability are critical issues, and I think we have a path to funding. The issue we understand is there's a lot of people on these lakes with a lot of different economic income and structure, and it's going to be hard to say that we have one answer for everybody. So we have to work with the stakeholders, model this better to make sure we can find the right affordability model and the right funding sources. And we're working with many stakeholders to make sure we have this broader flood issue, not just 4 lakes, kind of addressed. And we continue to look for broad support and advocacy, and that's what it's going to take. So thanks for being engaged. So that's, I think, my last slide. I think our mission here in 4 Lakes Task Force is to bring up the lakes, but to bring them up safely and as economically and affordable as possible. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sharon, for we can open a question and answers. I hope I didn't take too much time, but I felt we would cover a lot.
No, thank you. Thank you. I know there was a lot you went over there. Several questions kind of came around that the primary purpose of these dams and reconstructing is recreational in nature. But of course, as you talked about, there's a flooding component that has to be looked at in that. So could you maybe just elaborate just a bit more, understanding it's primarily recreational, but that flooding has to be something that you think about. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the point was that if you look at the basins that we work in, and you think about, in some ways, people, we live in a valley, but you don't see the valley when you sit in Midland. There's not big, huge mountains and stuff, and so there's a lot of capacity for water to flood, but it's really low capacity. So the idea that whether the flood's in or not, that the water that goes through this valley is going to end up in Midland no matter what. And so the big thing you don't want to do is have the dam fail. Now, the second question is could you build the dams to be flood controlled? If you were going to go spend, the 200 million, 250 to 350 on these, there's not enough benefit to do it. You'd be better off spending the money somewhere else for flood control. There's just simply not. There's maybe 1/10 the capacity in these basins if they were empty that would have, that would meet the requirement for flood control. So in other words, the water is going to come down here whether the dams are not into Midland. So we have to manage the strategy of flood mitigation in Midland differently, and we have to do it strategically. And so the point is that the Army Corps of Engineers is not going to come in here and say, hey, this is a great place to solve that problem. What we recognize here is that we can manage these dams better for the 100 and 200 and maybe even 300 or 400 year flood, but you can't manage it for 1,000 year, 2,000 year flood, because the dams will be underwater just like the rest of the city. So somewhere we have to kind of pick the right economic model to work on. And so it's kind of like a bathtub, right? I mean, you put water in and water comes out. When the dams are there, they come in and come out about the same rate. When the dams are not there, they come in and come out the same rate. The only way you can control it is you can bring the water down, but that may bring you that water will fill up in literally several hours, and we could see that as these issues come up. So it's more about making sure the dams don't fail and being responsive, having more systems on there, and yes, being proactive to lower the dams. But these dams didn't have enough capacity, and so they created other issues beyond just the flooding. And so that's the thing we have to work on and stuff to do. There'll be a lot of study on this and structure. And one of the things we're going to do, if you can imagine, you say, well, here's a 300-year flood, and when we model it, we will have what they call inundation maps that show, well, what gets flooded at 100-year floods with the dam and without the dam. And then can the dam control any of that? Those are the things we would lack. There's an argument that hey, if we were proactive in 14 days ahead, could we have lowered all that water and moved it down? Maybe we could, and that's one of the things we'll look at. But I would say it will delay it for a day. I mean, we've seen these dams fill up very quickly. There's just not enough capacity in them to make that big a difference. So we're worried about flood control, but it's got to be a strategic thing, and these dams can help. But if you think about 40% and they have maybe 10%, maybe they can help 4% of the flood control. They can't help, so if they only present 40% of the water and they have maybe 10% capacity of the water going down to kind of dampen it, it may help by 4 or 5%. It won't help by 50%. You know what I'm saying? So it's just the math of how much water we have coming in. There's 30 or 40 rivers coming into these 4 major rivers, and that's one of our challenges.
Thank you. Another question was, will the new dam flow be the run of the river?
Legally, the dams are set at a lake with plus or minus 8 inches roughly, depends on the lake. But and if you had hydropower, the reason it didn't run the river, you called peaking. The hydro operator would want to run it, raise the water high, and then at the right rate levels, run it low. Well, we don't have to change the lake levels, but we're not going to run around changing gauge so I would say the rivers would be more oriented to run of the river, keeping them consistent, because why would we run around and peak them if there's no hydropower? And second of all, it's more environmentally, I would say, good to do. We don't have to change the lake levels, we just have to run them that way. That's a different discussion. That's whether you raise the levers artificially during the day to generate power, is where run of the river gets in discussion. The other one is seasonal, is do we lower the dams in the season to really manage the ice flow. I mean, we're dealing with that now. Spring's going through, ice is falling through. We got to get them through through the waterways. So this helps manage ice flow and a little bit of management by having them lower in the winter.
Okay. And there was a question on when you talked about the gauges. What will the gauges define, and will it even the flow between the dams?
No, so one of the things that the gauges do is it helps in modeling. So we don't have, like, the radar systems north of these systems barely gets here. So we need to have more on the ground things to better model and understand the dams, and we need better warning systems, So what is the predictive nature of the dams? Our measurement basic, and I'm oversimplifying it, we get from NOAA and we look at the gauge at the end of the system. The more we know where it is, the more we can understand and model where we should put other mitigants, like diverting water somewhere else. There's ways you mitigate floods. You don't build in flood areas once you get a model right. You look at diversion models to move them away, and you look at faster response to kind of get people out of the way on these very major dams and even get property out of the way. So those are the things that we have to work on. I'm not saying, I'm trying to do this as I got into the thing. It's like, hey, we have never really strategically looked at these dams. So we're doing a lot of stuff on sewers and structures, but we sit at the base of these dams and we should know more about them. And that's kind of the key thing, both operationally and to feed into our modeling and future, because the weather pattern is changing, and you can't have 3 floods in 30 years that would have a 30% probability in 50 years and believe those frequencies are right. So we have to reset our thinking about what the frequencies are and how we're going to manage through it. And that the first thing these gauges do is help us manage and respond faster. The second thing they do is give us more information as we go forward.
Thank you. And you touched on this at the end, Dave, and that was just the affordability question for many of those that live in this area. And could you, and you, again, you talked a bit about that, but as residents of on the former lakes are concerned about that, what thoughts have you had to address some of the affordability concerns?
Well, so look, so the structure, and this is, I think, so I mean, first of all, explain the law quickly, because these are special assessment districts, so they're not taxing authorities. They're a special assessment district. They're under the control of the county. We're the delegated authority to set the roles and stuff, but they have to approve it. But the point is, it's based on benefit. So so if you have a $500,000 house next to a $100,000 house, on taxation, they would pay different in terms of value. On an assessment like a road or a drain, they get equal benefit. And so they're not based on value. So in a community like this, in a community of all these lake communities where the value of a lake, this water was free, you had a variety of people that could afford to do this over the generations. And there's a huge difference in income across these lakes. So when you throw a special assessment district on it, it doesn't work for everybody if it's too high. And so when you take a big number and the only mechanism you have to charge is this, it's painful. And so we are trying to offset that. Now, the two ways to offset it is figure out how to do it lower, figure out other ways and not bring other funders in and work through. I think as we go forward, we're going to find that, and first of all, no matter how perfect we are, there's some people are going to be, not going to be able to afford it. So the first thing we have to do is recognize by lake, it's a different problem. Okay, so Secord Lake has a different affordability structure than Sanford, but it has a lower cost rate too. So we feel like we can get in a special assessment district in and working on that. And Sanford is a unique one in that it has the average income in Midland is 60,000. Okay, the average value on those homes on the lake are 250,000. In Gladwin, it's 40,000. On the average home on Wixom Lake is 120,000. So Wixom Lake has a real big challenge because it's more cost. There's two dams, and we have to work on that. And to me, even when we get it all done and say this is the number, then you have to look at, well, what's the appetite for the community? That's why the survey. And then how do we deal with people that are going to be needing with help? We just can't say, hey, that's the number, live with it. So we'll have to look at ways to either lower the total number or look at how we manage people, especially people that are homesteaded, and that's their primary help. We'll have to look at things to look. We're talking about, do we put endowments in? Do we look at state things to kind of help people manage if they're truly economic challenged in it? And that's part of the whole discussion is it feasible for the community? And then how do you manage the individual? And what's been a big issue here, I'm sorry, I'm thinking this is like the big issue. So is we're just trying to give the numbers as best we have as we go forward. And the numbers are getting better because we're learning more, but we can't hide the number, because if we just say it's all going to be better, we can't surprise people at the end. So we're trying to have this dialogue as we go through.
Appreciate that, and thank you. I know we're really at the end of our time, and I have a few concluding things. There were a lot of things we didn't get to, so we will get those to you, Dave, so that you can, if there are other questions that you can, because I know there's quite a bit in the chat, that you can address some of those. But thank you. Thanks for coming, for sharing this information, for addressing. I know these are difficult, discussions, subjects, the work that you're doing. So,
No, I appreciate it, Sharon. I see that we have like 44 questions. So I will, but as you send them to us, we'll commit to bringing them through, and I'm sure we have some questions are pretty easy to answer, and some might be challenging, but we'll make sure we get through them and get a response back.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining today. And as we close, I did want to just remind everyone that as individuals are still seeking assistance to help with recovery from the flood, we encourage them to call 211 reliefmidland.org. Of course, we would encourage them, if they're not already connected with our disaster case managers, I know some of whom are on the call with us today, we very much encourage you to connect with them. And actually, if one of our disaster case managers wouldn't mind putting the phone number there so folks have it and they could write it down very easily, that would be wonderful. And I wanted just to mention that we encourage you to look at previous session topics as well for those that you might want to learn more about. Our next flood recovery session call is going to be on April 8th, and it will focus on neighbors helping neighbors. So telling some stories of some of the amazing things that happened and continue to happen in our community as we work to help one another recover. And then I will mention that May's session will look at mental well-being, because we know that as we come into May, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. And I know that's a very difficult time. So we are going to have speakers looking at mental well-being and just self-care, things that might be helpful for you or for others, as we come up on the 1-year anniversary. As always, we ask you to register in advance for these, and we will get the Zoom link to you. So thank you all for joining us today for this flood recovery session call. Thanks to our speaker, Dave Kepler from the 4 Lakes Task Force, for presenting information to the group. And again, any sessions that you would like to, topics that you would like to see handled in these sessions, please let us know. I know some of the things that we've done have come from suggestions from the group, as we looked at city and county housing codes, as we talked about mental well-being, as we looked at FEMA, so suggestions that many of you had on topics that you would like to see us cover. So again, thank you for joining us. And I do see that we have 2 of our case managers, thank you, disaster case managers, put the phone number for the flood recovery line, which is, again, I know it's easier to write it down, but that 989-374-8000 number. So encourage you to reach out there as well. So thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.